My wife and I have been together for 8 years. She is insanely beautiful and charming. I cherished her. But no matter how sweet it may seem, a dark period has come in my life. As you can imagine, my wife wanted to get rid of me in at least 3 different ways. It's just mind-boggling. I did a terrible thing, more terrible than she did, but I don't feel any regret, and now I'm going to tell you my story. Dorothy and I have been married for 8 years. We graduated from college together and tied the knot a year later. Both of us have stable jobs, diligently saving money for our first home. The only point of contention in our otherwise harmonious marriage is our differing views on parenthood. While I desire children, Dorothy shows no interest in becoming a mother. Our sexual journey began in college, and we always stuck to certain boundaries. Our sex life was vibrant and consistent. Up to a certain point, everything started to change about 5 months ago. Birdwatching, a common passion, originally brought us together during college. Having met during a birdwatching trip, we discovered mutual interests and found joy in each other's company. Our first sexual encounter took place in the forest, which became Dorothy's favorite place for intimate moments. Dorothy, with her shoulder-length, brown hair and swarthy, Mediterranean skin, had small, firm, and perfectly round breasts. Her waist was an hourglass, and her butt was toned and soft. Perhaps her reluctance to have children stemmed from the fear of changing her beautiful physique. But honestly, if I were in her place, I would also delay the birth of children a little. I admired Dorothy's thick dark hair, and her decision not to shave off excess body hair added to her unique charm. I was head over heels in love with this woman. I was walking down the street with her, holding her hand and thinking to myself, mine. Our most favorite activity was birdwatching, but due to excessive work commitments, I neglected our relationship, and Dorothy started birdwatching alone. She scrupulously kept a diary of bird sightings, demonstrating an almost obsessive dedication to the cause. Absorbed in my work, I often fell asleep on the couch, returning home late. After a few days without intimacy, I expected Dorothy to be eager, but she seemed relieved by the lack of physical contact. Worried, I reflected on my past character problems, which had improved over the years. I changed my work schedule to spend more time with Dorothy, eliminating the tension in our relationship. Unaware of the infidelity, I felt Dorothy's displeasure and suggested a romantic vacation. However, Dorothy expressed concern about the long absence from work, stressing the importance of following our financial plan for the down payment on the house. She assured me of her happiness, but hinted at potential problems. Despite my efforts to improve our marriage, a feeble attempt at intimacy that night was met with a terrible headache. Out of curiosity, I checked her diary and found that she regularly leaves the house. To investigate, I used my Honda CB motorcycle, which I rode to work and which I inherited from my late grandfather. Dorothy usually returned home around 4 p.m. That day, I informed my secretary about my work plans in the archive and waited for them to send me there. When I was sent to the archive, I was alone there, which played into my hands, and I began to wait for the time to secretly leave work. The time was approaching, and I started packing. Because the archive was in the basement, there were no landlines here, and no one came down here almost never. I used the emergency fire exit, securing the door with a small wedge so that it would not lock and so that I could then return without any problems. Within 5 minutes, I parked on the street adjacent to our house, waiting for my wife to return at the usual time. As soon as she arrived, changed her clothes, and headed to the birdwatching site, I, knowing about her purpose, followed her at a respectful distance. Thanks to our frequent visits, I easily navigated the park and parked my motorcycle among the trees. Walking along another path, I moved carefully, trying to avoid any noise. My bird-watching experience allowed me to periodically stop and inspect the surroundings with binoculars. As I climbed the mountain, the trails became more and more difficult, marked but dangerously close to dangerous ledges, ideal for hawk watching, especially at this time of year, which offers spectacular views of the valley below. Unable to resist, I peered through my binoculars, focusing on the valley for early hawk arrivals. Amidst the enchanting scene, I suddenly heard giggling. The dense forest concealed them effectively, making it hard for me to spot. My attention honed in on the subtle sounds, eventually locating them by the yellow lining of her vest. Setting up my scope in a concealed spot, I lay prone, observing discreetly. Equipped with both binoculars and a camera attached to the scope, I could capture a detailed picture. My wife's companion turned out to be Jimmy Baxter, a colleague she met 6 months ago. I knew him from corporate events where he seemed like a pleasant guy with a seemingly perfect family. Dorothy's infidelity puzzled me. Why would a man with such an ideal family engage in such behavior? Jimmy spread out the blanket and Dorothy undressed casually. I took careful pictures while he was satisfying her desires, a moment devoid of romance. Watching them have sex, I realized that my growing anger surpassed the initial shock. It was difficult for me to accept the fact that I am now watching from the bushes, how my wife is engaged in intimacy with a man whom I have seen many times before. Despite the urge to intervene, I forced myself to endure without having a clear plan. When they ended their brief relationship, I watched Dorothy's seemingly carefree behavior, and Jimmy's nonchalant attitude indicated that they had no love affair. Then why was all this necessary? Angry and worried, I quickly packed my things, following Dorothy as she walked down the path. Keeping at a distance so that I would not be noticed, I reached the observation deck of the Hawk Mountain, a picturesque but dangerous place. Jimmy appeared standing there, and although my blood boiled, outwardly I remained calm. He was probably going home to his wife. When he asked me what I was doing, apparently not remembering me, I fabricated a story about a red-tailed hawk feeding its chicks on a distant pine tree, hiding the truth. Continuing to lie, I tell him,
"Over there, at the other end of the hillock, strewn with cones, remains invisible to me."
He went to the edge, bent down, then looked back at me.
"Do I know you from somewhere?"
he asked.
"Yes, we've met. I'm Howard Haas, Dorothy's husband."
His eyes widened, and his last words were a surprised,
"Oh, shit."
When I couldn't stand it anymore and pushed him off the edge of the mountain and he flew down like a stone. The next few moments unfolded in slow motion. It seemed like an eternity before he reached the bottom, and I heard a deafening bang, although reality shows that only 4 or 5 seconds had passed it. As I peered over, my cell phone rang. Jimmy lay face down, his leg unilaterally positioned. I answered the call, engaged in a conversation with Stephanie, assuring her I'd be back upstairs in about 10 minutes. I swapped my hiking boots for Oxfords before leaving for the office, discarding the boots in a nearby dumpster. Dorothy was taken aback by my early return. Jimmy's body was discovered the following day, making the evening news. Dorothy, upset, questioned why he hadn't come to work, and everyone speculated on his absence. Dorothy seemed surprised when I inquired about Rainbow Mountain, suggesting she wasn't aware of his activities. Detective Louis Lang and his colleague visited me at work 2 days later. He introduced himself and explained they were trying to gather information regarding Jimmy's accident. The detective mentioned Jimmy and my wife's supposed relationship, hinting at possible upset on my part. I vehemently denied any knowledge of such a relationship, stating that my wife and Jimmy merely worked together. Detective Lang persisted, revealing that my wife had confessed to dating Jimmy for over 3 months. He inquired about how we met, but I deflected, asserting that it was a matter for my wife and me to address privately. The detective mentioned Stephanie's account of my whereabouts on Tuesday, suggesting I spent most of the day in the basement. I clarified that it was only a couple of hours, and the rest of the time I was in my office. The detective left after verifying my alibi and expressing apologies. Furious, I threw a stapler across the room, feeling smoke metaphorically coming out of my ears. Stephanie walked in, expressing concern that she might have said something wrong. I assured her that she didn't get me into trouble and thanked her for her assistance. I answered Stephanie's questions as truthfully as I could.
"It's okay, Stephanie. It seems my wife and I are facing some personal problems. You may have to cover for me for the next few days. Looks like I'll be very busy."
"No problem,"
Stephanie responded, understanding my situation. However, my intention wasn't to resolve issues with Dorothy. All I wanted was to find a better way to end our marriage. Thankfully, we had no children, and we lived in a rented house. Although I once dreamed of having children, Now I was grateful to Dana for cheating on me, and now we don't have to share a common personal space. It wasn't even 3 yet, but I packed my belongings and walked out the door. Stephanie nodded in understanding as I left. Our household account held $95,000, and I took $72,000 with me as I headed to the local GM dealer. 2 hours later, $59,000 poorer, I left in a yellow Hummer. I realized I didn't need a new home. I needed extra money for gas. Shortly after pulling into the driveway, Dorothy came out and questioned the extravagant purchase. I revealed my new car, explaining that I needed something more sporty. Dorothy was furious, wondering how we would afford such a purchase. I reassured her, saying I paid for it in cash. However, her anger escalated when she questioned the source of the money. As we entered the house, a crowd had gathered outside. Dorothy grabbed my hand, questioning why I referred to myself as a single guy and why I decided not to buy a house with her. I responded, explaining that I bought the Hummer because I didn't see a reason to stay with her. The tension increased when Dorothy told me about Detective Lang's visit and the suspicion that I was somehow involved in the death of Jimmy Baxter. Dorothy accused me of infidelity, claiming that I cheated on her for more than 3 months with my employee at work. In response, I denied the accusations, claiming that I had never cheated on her with anyone. How did she even have the audacity to claim that I cheated on her? I felt a surge of anger, and my fists clenched. I had incriminating photos that could prove her wrong, but showing them would also expose my presence at Rainbow Mountain on the day Jimmy died. Dorothy continued to accuse me of infidelity, and I refuted it, but later it almost came to a fight. Dorothy subsequently stated that I would not get a divorce, insisting that I sleep in a new truck. She kicked me out of the house, saying we were going to Jimmy's funeral together anyway, but my response was blunt.
Kiss my ass.
The funeral was unusual, with both Jimmy and his wife from outside the area. Dorothy and I attended, and during the ceremony, emotions ran high. Heather, Jimmy's widow, confronted Dorothy, accusing her of destroying her marriage and family. Dorothy was left speechless, and the tension lingered as we left the funeral. As we stood by the car, several onlookers overheard the heated exchange. My attention shifted to Heather Baxter, who observed my wife's departure with a visible hatred in her eyes. Attempting to defuse the situation, I offered an apology on behalf of my wife, suggesting that any offense accused was unintentional. Heather dismissed my attempt, labeling me a weakling for defending someone who had cheated. Walking back to the car, Dorothy remained silent during the journey home. Upon our arrival, she unleashed her frustration, questioning my decision to attend the funeral, only to be humiliated. She accused me of being manipulated into the situation and retreated into the house without another word. From that point onward, I chose to sleep in the spare bedroom, finding relief in the absence of any expectations for intimacy. The following day, feeling a sense of obligation, I drove to Heather Baxter's house, uncertain about what to say. She was in the garage with her sons, occupied with sorting through boxes. Despite my attempt to apologize, Heather remained focused on her tasks, expressing her lack of time for my concerns. Offering assistance, she accepted, directing me to help with clearing her late husband's belongings. Taking charge, Heather guided me to the master bedroom, instructing me to empty Jimmy's closet and drawers, bagging everything for goodwill. Her young boys, Josh and Terry, also joined in. They shook my hand after completing the task, and I left with bags of clothing. Back at home, Dorothy was cooking chili. In an attempt to establish communication, I suggested that, given recent events, it might be better for us to consider a divorce. Dorothy, however, rejected the idea, denying any connection with Jimmy, and expressing her commitment to preserving the marriage. Trying to understand, I asked her to explain, and she told me that our ideas about the future were incompatible. Dorothy insisted on staying at home, refusing to get a divorce because she saw no excuse for a divorce. The evening meal was consumed in silence, with Dorothy exhibiting an apathetic attitude. Later, I began experiencing stomach pains, and after multiple trips to the bathroom, I started vomiting, noting the presence of blood. Seeking help, I asked Dorothy to take me to the hospital.
No way, the emergency room? Absolutely not. Desperate Housewives is just around the corner. If your stomach hurts, take Tums. It's more than a stomach ache.
Dorothy, can we please go to the hospital?
You're behaving like a child.
I grabbed the keys and headed to the car. My neighbor, taking out the trash, asked what happened, and I explained. He then took me to the emergency room. I woke up to the sunlight streaming through the window. Detective Lang was there, reading a magazine. He greeted me and mentioned that I'd been treated for a bad reaction to chili, which they suspected was intentionally poisoned. The doctor confirmed it, and Detective Lang explained they had to pump me out and administer some unpronounceable drugs, essentially rat poison. They checked Dorothy, who ate the same food, and found nothing suspicious at home. The doctor allowed me to go home when ready, providing a list of bland foods. I borrowed Detective Lang's number and called Heather to apologize. Louis answered and questioned why Dorothy would want to harm me. I didn't have an answer. Back home, Dorothy was apologetic for not being more responsive. Disturbed, I locked myself in the spare room. From that point on, I avoided eating at home. The next day, I informed Stephanie about my sick leave and asked her to find me an apartment. Dorothy, unaware of my plans, apologized profusely. Upset by the police's inability to solve the poisoning, I visited my insurance agent. I had taken out a $1 million life insurance policy with Dorothy as the beneficiary. Cashing out the policies and canceling health insurance, I changed beneficiaries to my mother. At the bank, Dorothy had cleared out $12,000 from the house fund. I explained the situation, and they agreed to close the credit cards. Opening a new account, I signed the necessary papers. Stephanie offered her help, and the bank manager assisted in securing my finances. Dorothy, dressed for birdwatching, mentioned she'd relax on Rainbow Mountain. Suspicious, I decided to play along. After she left, I spotted her car in the upper parking lot next to a gray Ford Ranger. Riding a motorcycle, I quickly circled the mountain. In the lower section, her mountain bike was chained, and Dorothy was talking to a man with a small shotgun. They exchanged a photo and an envelope, and Dorothy headed towards me. Ducking behind a ledge, I silently observed. The man watched the trail from the upper parking lot, assuming I'd come from there. Dorothy expected me to follow her. Downstairs, her bike had disappeared. At the top parking lot, I found an unlocked Ford, confirming my suspicions. I found my tracksuit on the front seat, took out the registration card from the glove compartment, a pack of matches from the center console, and my sweatpants. I tightly twisted them and dropped them into the gas tank, lighting the end. After causing an explosion, I hurriedly left the scene, hoping Dorothy had given him enough money to cover it. To avoid running into Dorothy, I broke a few traffic rules while taking the back roads on my way home. Parking the bike behind the garage, I grabbed the fertilizer spreader and began pushing it across the lawn. Soon, my wife came outside, a disappointed expression on her face. Her cell phone rang, and while I couldn't hear the conversation, it seemed the caller was excited about something. Howard, explaining that I left the Volvo in the mountains and decided to cycle home to warm up, asked her for a ride back. During the ride, she played with her fingers, clearly worried. As we approached the mountain road, we encountered fire engines climbing to the top. A policeman stopped us, informing us of an accident and the ensuing fire at the top of the mountain. Dorothy's car was parked there, and we were eventually allowed to go up with a police escort. Dorothy, looking at me as she stepped out of the Hummer, thanked me and told me to go home. When she was out of sight, I followed her to the top, taking advantage of the commotion. She spoke with a guy on the trail, trying to calm him down. After arguing for about 10 minutes, they walked to the fire chief, and eventually Dorothy and the man got into the Volvo. Hurrying back to the Hummer, I left before they could sort out the fire trucks and hoses. While driving out, I saw a Volvo turning the corner. At home, I immediately left in the Honda to meet Heather. Apologizing for being late, I shared a toned-down version of the story with her, and we spent time with Josh and Terry, ordering pizza for dinner. Later, I returned home, and Dorothy arrived late. I refrained from asking where she was. The next morning, during Dorothy's shower, I removed the SIM chip from her mobile phone. I deactivated her service at the cell phone office and paid a $200 cancellation fee. Landlines, DSL, and cable television would be turned off by the end of the day. I notified the landlord about my move out, suggesting he contact Dorothy for a new lease. Water and electricity would be turned off by the week's end. Quickly loading my things into the Hummer, I headed to the apartment Stephanie had found. She left a note mentioning Detective Lang had asked her to call him. At the station, Detective Lang chuckled, remarking that I was still alive. He mentioned a man named Bobby Terrell and showed me the Ford registration number. I denied knowing Bobby and handed over the registration. Lang revealed that my wife and Bobby had been talking frequently, withdrawing a significant amount of money. Learning about a life insurance policy I canceled, Lang warned me that Bobby might still be a threat despite losing his truck. He appreciated how I handled the situation and informed Bobby about our conversation. Lang was investigating the reason behind my wife wanting me dead, particularly since I canceled the insurance policy without her knowledge. If something happens in the near future, I'll take him away immediately. We recommended he take some time off, but I doubt this will discourage your wife. I moved out of the house, and Lewis sensed that I might not be sharing everything. All the pieces didn't seem to fit together, and he urged caution. I immediately went to Heather and we went to lunch, enjoying sushi together. Trying to explain the situation cryptically, I avoided divulging too much. Our lengthy lunch led to her inviting me for dinner. Despite apologizing for the confusion, Heather found it amusing. I felt a sense of comfort around her. The following day, I decided to return to work. After a pleasant evening with friends, Heather and I had big plans for the weekend. Surprisingly, I realized I didn't miss Dorothy at all. As I drove to work with a smile, everything seemed to be going well. However, as I descended a hill, I noticed an issue with the brakes. They didn't respond. Despite attempting to shift gears and slow down, the Hummer kept accelerating. Faced with traffic and intersections, I turned sharply, causing the vehicle to spin and flip over. Darkness enveloped me, and the next time I woke up, I was in a hospital room. Groaning and sensing movement, a nurse looked into my eyes, followed by a qualified doctor. There was pain, but Heather's presence comforted me. The medical team evaluated my injuries and I fell asleep again. When I woke up later, Heather was sleeping in a chair. With aching pain, I realized my body was on the mend. Lewis checked on me daily, and I learned about my injuries: a concussion, broken collarbone, arm, and ribs. The medical team was concerned about my unconsciousness for 2 days. After 2 days, I was hungry and received some soup. Lewis appeared, apologizing for not noticing the brake lines on the Hummer had been cut. They suspected foul play and questioned Dorothy's whereabouts. Heather had visited daily, but Dorothy signed admission forms and disappeared. Despite being in pain, I was ready to leave the hospital. Heather, who had been taking care of me, informed me that the doctor suggested I could go to her place. Heather and I spent time together, and Heather took care of my recovery. Stephanie visited, and I decided to go back to work. Upon returning to the old house, we spoke to the owner about removing our belongings. Stephanie continued her visits, and I was planning to go back to work. However, my relationship with Heather evolved from platonic to romantic. I moved into her bedroom and our connection deepened. We attended social events and parent-teacher conferences together. After about 3 months, I decided to propose to Heather. Over dinner, I expressed my desire to spend the rest of my life with her. She accepted, but there was a small problem. I needed to meet her family in Philadelphia.
That's the end of the story. Write your opinion in the comments. Did the main character do the right thing when he decided to get rid of his wife's lover? Did his wife know that he was involved in this? Why did the main character's wife want to get rid of him? We think that the main character did a terrible thing. He did the wrong thing. Whatever the circumstances, this does not justify the main character, and the fact that everything is fine with him in the end and he was left unpunished is bad. The wife knew that her husband did it with 99% probability. Otherwise, why would she try to make several attempts on his life? In this story, all the ambiguous characters, even the widow, who a couple of months later married a man who was involved in the death of her husband. It's terrible. But we hope that you have drawn the right conclusions and the story seemed at least interesting to you. We will be grateful if you like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks and good luck.